What they were practicing then was not risk arbitrage, where one buys the securities of a target company after a deal is announced, betting on the transactions going through, but classic arbitrage. Icahn would buy a convertible bond at 100, convertible to 10 shares of stock at 10, and then he would simultaneously sell 10 shares short at 10 and 1/8, thus locking in the eighth of a point professor IT on each share. Then he introduced options into the mix, in elaborate hedging formulas that left him protected on the downside with the potential for an enormous upside. There were great opportunities to make money, Icahn said, recalling a particularly gratifying transaction in Polaroid where a combination of buying stock, puts and calls brought him $1.50 million for what he insists was no risk. The ARBs didn't know options, and the options brokers certainly didn't understand arbitrage. The ARBs kept arbitrage very quiet in those days. There were only a few doing it, like Gus Levy at Goldman Sachs. So when I put together arbitrage with options, it was really great.
Always, I looked for a spot that was not too popular.
You want to be in something other people don't see, and which makes eminent sense. In 1973, the Chicago Board Options Exchange opened, and the Phi-Elds soon became too crowded for Icahn's taste. Kingsley, meanwhile, had been hedging capitalizations of various companies, which he described as constantly molding a position. It was like a washing machine, going round and round. I'd look at the whole ITT mess, of varying securities, and I'd say, I could buy this preferred, short that security, and all he hedged. And then the next day I'd buy some other issue, sell against that. Round and round. It was driving me crazy, and I started getting really bored. Kingsley said it was boredom that drove him from Icahn and Company in 1973 and led him to a small firm named F.L. Solomon, to specialize in new issues. One longtime associate of Kingsley disputed that explanation, saying Kingsley left because Icahn was paying him spit. Icahn is notoriously tight FI stead. It seems to pain him to give another dollar. Even in later years, after he had made over $100 million, he groused when his team of investment bankers, working until 2 a.m., ordered steaks from Smith & Walensky's restaurant. Law Phi RMS that did work for him would often wait months to be paid. Another of Kingsley's associates said he was disappointed at not having been made a partner in Icahn and Company, but by this time Icahn was shedding partners, not making them. He was already notorious for his sudden rages, and for the abuse he heaped upon employees, minority partners, outside lawyers. No one was exempt. Kaminer left, then Goldsmith left, although he said Icahn offered to increase his equity share if he remained. Freilich was later reduced to his 1%. Even Schnall was relieved of his stake. Schnall had not been admitted to an exclusive beach club in Southampton, Long Island, and he decided to leave New York, changing his whole social circle, which summered in Southampton, and moved to New Canaan, Connecticut. Icahn suggested that it might be a good time for him to take his money out, since Wall Street was in the doldrums and Schnall was nervous, but he asked Schnall to leave his bonds there. Schnall agreed, and continues to receive what Icahn calls his allowance of $100,000 a year. To this day Schnall chafes at having agreed to give back his 20%. Kingsley, meanwhile, was finding the world outside Icahn and Company inhospitable. F.L. Solomon went out of business. Kingsley joined another firm, and it soon merged with yet another. Every 3 weeks, he says, there was another name on the door. If acumen were the only determinant, Kingsley certainly should have thrived on Wall Street. Jeffrey Steiner, who assisted Nelson Peltz and would become one of Icahn's principal investors in the 80s, called Kingsley the most clever business analyst I have ever met in 30 years in business. But Kingsley, a short, rotund Buddy Hackett look-alike, an Orthodox Jew who leaves work early on Friday so as to be home for the Sabbath before sundown, did not fight nor did he aspire to, in the white shoe investment banking world. And life in the bottom-tier RMS that were struggling for survival in Wall Street in 1974 had little to recommend it. In 1975, Kingsley returned to Icahn and Company after less than 2 years away. Even while he was away, Kingsley had continued to talk to Icahn. In one of their conversations he had mentioned that he thought there were great investments to be made in undervalued situations. The one he recommended was a closed-end mutual fund named Highland. Kingsley bought some of its shares for his customers, Icahn bought some, and after Kingsley rejoined Icahn they accumulated a block of about 30%, which management, distinct from the company, then bought back in 1976. It was a 2-year play, it took us a lot of time to accumulate, Kingsley recalled. But we bought at 2 and we sold at 6. That was the beginning. After that, they accumulated positions of 4.9%. At 5% a shareholder must file a 13D disclosure document with the SEC, in several more closed-end funds at discounts to their real value. The stock prices then went up, and they made a Professor IT. Because these were mutual funds, all one had to do to determine whether they were undervalued was to compute the value of their portfolio and compare that to its stock price. That was the chicken way of playing, said Kingsley, comparing it to the task of targeting a company, whose value is harder to quantify. And after we'd done those, Carl said, "This is an interesting way to invest, let's do some more." In 1978 Icahn waged a proxy FI-GHT to gain control of a real estate investment trust named Baird & Warner. Like Milken, who had been investing in Wright Paper through the mid-70s, Icahn recognized that there was a lot of hidden value in the depressed Wright industry. And Baird & Warner was not a troubled Wright, just one whose stock price had suffered because of the Wrights' general disrepute. While Baird & Warner's assets were mainly illiquid at that time, they were worth about $30 million, a nice pool of capital for Icahn to control. Icahn renamed this Wright Bayswater, after his childhood neighborhood, and eventually caused it to revoke its status as a Wright, in order to invest in new types of real estate-related activities and also in the securities of public companies. Bayswater thus became a vehicle for raids. The proxy FI-GHT, a campaign for the shareholder vote held at a public company's annual meeting, now became Icahn's weapon of choice. In the 1950s, proxy FI-GHTs had been waged by outsiders, such as Robert Young at New York Central Railroad, to persuade stockholders to throw out incumbent managements and install them instead. At that time, however, the advantage lay with the incumbents. As long as management was paying a dividend and was not tinged with scandal, stockholders would rarely vote for a raider. By 1979, the odds had changed. Forbes magazine reported that a check of 20 FIV proxy actions taken that year showed management the victor in 12 and dissidents in 13. Icahn and others had started a new wave proxy FI-GHT, in which the aim was not so much to replace management, although Icahn had done this at Baird & Warner, as to attract the attention of third parties to an undervalued company. And the issues in the proxy FI-GHT were framed in terms of shareholder Professor ITS. Icahn would point out that the stock was trading at some paltry fraction of book value, and that there was real potential for better earnings. In 1979 Icahn won a proxy FI-GHT to gain board seats and then forced the sale of Tapan, the stove maker, whose stock was trading at around 8 and had a book value of over $20 a share, to AB Electrolux, a Swedish-owned home appliance manufacturer, at a price that gave Icahn a Professor IT of close to $3 million. Tapan worked like a charm for Carl, said his lawyer for that deal, Morris Orens of Olshan Grundman and Frome. It clearly demonstrated that if you are right about the company's assets being undervalued, and the company wishes to put itself up for sale, there will be buyers out there. Icahn was ebullient. Discussing proxy-fied GHTS aimed at forcing a sellout, he told Forbes, "I think the risk-reward ratios there are a very exciting thing. Much better than arbitrage. It's the wave of the future." Icahn moved on to Saxon Industries, the copier company, where after threatening a proxy-fied GHT he sold back his 9.5% stake to the company at a premium over the market, making a $2 million Professor IT. It was his Phi RST public green mailing, selling back to a company at a higher price than was available to other shareholders. But the word, greenmail, had not yet been coined. The activity, which had been carried out by others such as Victor Posner and Saul Steinberg, was known as a buyback at a premium, or a bon voyage bonus. Now that Icahn was launched into this new game, it was time for him to divest himself of his last meaningful partner, Fred Sullivan. From now on he would accept investors in his deals, but would share equity with no one, except Freilich, with his 1%. Fred Sullivan, the CEO of Walter Kidde, a small Phi re-extinguisher company that he had built into a major conglomerate, had met Icahn when Carl was a trainee at Dreyfus, and Icahn had become Sullivan's broker. In the early 70s, Kidde had invested in Icahn and Company and owned approximately 19%. "We sold back about 1 year after Tapan, at a Professor IT for Kidde shareholders," recalled Sullivan. Carl wanted to buy it back. Asked whether he felt he had any choice, Sullivan replied, "Well, he could have just put it, the Professor ITS, all in another entity if we had refused. Carl is very clever. And we decided not to test him." On Icahn's modus operandi in those early raids, Sullivan remarked, "Carl didn't have the money to finish the deal. He genuinely thought that the price of the stock was undervalued, and he genuinely thought that the values could be realized. He bought on that basis. It was only later, when greenmail started to be excoriated, that he defended it on the grounds that these companies were poorly managed. And when Icahn descended upon his adversaries, the chief executive officers of his target companies, he must have seemed like a nightmare come suddenly to life. After Saxon, Icahn's next target was the Hammermill Paper Company. "Here's this poor guy from Hammermill, Albert Duval, its CEO. A real Ivy League guy," said Sullivan, "and he's sitting there thinking that the world works the way it always has, with his golf club and his graduating class, and he never raises his voice, and all of a sudden, he's got Carl, who is such a Phi GHTER. It's terrible. Carl was a scourge in those days. Carl is a dedicated capitalist. He is dedicated to amassing capital. He decided that he wanted to make money. Now, a lot of us made that decision, but few are as dedicated to it as Carl." 7 years after Icahn appeared on his threshold owning approximately 9% of the company's stock, Duval spoke of him with a bitterness which made it seem like yesterday. "I formed the opinion that this was not for us, in the Phi RST few minutes of my meeting with Carl," Duval declared. Asked what it was that was so quickly decisive, Duval replied, "He said he wanted to piece off the company. He said, 'I'm only in this for the money. I don't know anything about the paper business. I don't care anything about the paper business. All I care about is the money, and I want it quick.'" Duval added, however, that Icahn did not ask explicitly to be bought out. Had he done so, that could have hurt him later in a proxy contest, as the company could have used it against him to discredit all his claims of wanting to increase the company's value, and expose him instead as someone who had asked for greenmail. "Everyone knew who Carl Icahn was in those days," explained one securities lawyer. When you're a green mailer, you don't have to ask for green mail. He said he wanted to get on the board, Duval continued. He wanted to force it, the company, to a merger. He said repeatedly that he had no interest in the paper business. Well, everybody that worked there did. As far as we were concerned, the company had a future as well as a past and a present, but Carl just wanted to parcel it out as fast as he could. I'm sure if I had said, "Here's your money," at a price over market, he'd have taken it right then, Duval added. Instead, Duval, with the help of takeover lawyer Joe Flom from Skadden, Arps, instituted anti-takeover measures, mounted his own proxy campaign, and sued Icahn, charging him with disclosure violations and fraud. Icahn Phi led a counterclaim, alleging violations in Hammermill's solicitation of proxies. One of Duval's lawyers said, Duval called Icahn's bluff. He said, "I'm not putting you on the board. I'm not buying you out. I'm not selling the company right now." Icahn was a known quantity at that point. He was someone who had about 10 to 20 million at his disposal. You didn't have to worry that he'd make a tender offer for the company, he didn't have the money. At 10 or 11% of the company's stock, he was tapped out. One of Icahn's lawyers conference IRMED that Icahn was stretched to his limit in each of these early deals. He was really a gambler, everything he had was in each of these deals. Each one got bigger, because he would plow the Professor ITS from the one before back in. And the leverage was enormous, so a loss would have been devastating. Icahn narrowly lost the Hammermill proxy contest. To make matters worse, it was discovered that he had voted about 70,000 shares that he had borrowed, and then returned, after voting day. Icahn's defense was that he had been buying stock through the days just preceding the election and was afraid that not all of it would clear in time for him to vote it, so he had borrowed some in order to be sure he had the full voting benefit of what he owned. Duval met Icahn in a hotel room in Erie, Pennsylvania, where Hammermill is located, not long after the voting of the borrowed shares had been discovered. Icahn had lost the contest. The company was not offering to buy him out at a premium, but he was sitting there with close to 10% of the company's stock, and settlement talks were at an impasse. I used a lot of vulgar language, Duval recalled. I said, "You're the damnedest liar and cheat I know. We're going to take out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that says, 'Icahn cheats.'" I walked to the elevator, and he followed me and said, "Please, come back, we'll talk." Duval is convinced that it was that meeting, and that threat, that broke the impasse, since not long after that, at the end of July 1980, they were finally able to reach settlement terms. For the next year, Icahn was prohibited from engaging in a proxy contest with Hammermill, and he granted Hammermill a right of FI-RST refusal on the shares owned by the Icahn Group. Hammermill paid Icahn $750,000 for his expenses. Through the next year, Icahn mounted no raids. According to one former insider, he was stymied because most of his capital was tied up. He and his investors had invested about $10.60 million in Hammermill stock. Then, when the standstill expired after a year, Hammermill bought him out at a premium. The price of the stock had risen considerably in the past year. Icahn made a Professor IT of about $9 million over his initial investment. Someone else might have been tempted to sell back without a premium after the debacle of the proxy contest, in order to free up all his funds. But, as one lawyer who has been opposite Icahn on a number of his forays pointed out, Icahn's style in 1980 was a whole lot of bluff and bluster. His game was, "I will not be bluffed out." For him to have sold out at market, after losing the proxy contest, he viewed, I believe, as a signal to the next 10 CEOs. Fight the proxy FI GHT, beat him, and he'll go away. In those days he never made any pretense to doing something socially beneficial. The Carl Icahn of 1980 was still trying to figure out how this game was played, and what he could get away with. For Icahn, the lawyer added, the game never became personalized. Icahn would make whatever attacks on management seemed to be required to win a proxy fight, and he understood that his opponents would unleash their armaments on him, but he seemed surprised when he saw how personal was his target's animus for him. If Carl had his druthers, these fights would have been like two gentlemen dueling. You take your best pokes, but when it's over, why not go out and have a beer together? His targets, however, tended not to see Icahn's game as sporting. People don't like to be challenged, this lawyer commented. Particularly kings in their own castles. In early 1982, Icahn led a raid on the huge retailer Marshall Field that established him as a serious predator. He surfaced, as was his habit, with a little over 10% of the company's stock. But one day later Icahn and his group reported that they owned 14.3%. 1 week after that, they led at 19.4%. What had happened was that additional investors, including British financier Alan Clore, and Marvin Warner, then chairman of the Cincinnati-based Home State Savings Bank, had jumped on the Icahn bandwagon. After his group had acquired nearly 20% of the stock, Icahn executed a loan agreement for $20 million with Jeffrey Steiner on behalf of a small bank Steiner controlled in Paris, Banque Commerciale Privée. Under the margin rules, which allow one to borrow up to 50% of the purchase price of the stock, this would have enabled Icahn to buy $40 million of stock. Marshall Field fought back with a lawsuit as Hammermill had, making the usual battery of allegations about violations of federal securities laws, but added something novel as well: a RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, count, usually reserved for dealing with organized crime. It charged Icahn with having invested income derived from a pattern of racketeering to acquire his interest in Marshall Field, whose activities affected interstate and foreign commerce. The complaint charged that this pattern, which was defined to include violations of securities laws, could be found in Icahn's history of infractions over the past decade. These were laid out in detail. There was a consent order from the New Jersey Bureau of Securities, a censure from the New York Stock Exchange, a consent agreement with the New York Stock Exchange, an assurance of discontinuance from the New York State Attorney General's Office, and 4 decisions levying fines against Icahn and Company by the Chicago Board Options Exchange. And, finally, there was a consent decree Icahn had entered into with the SEC in 1981, alleging various securities law violations in Bayswater, Saxon, and Hammermill, involving the borrowed shares. Marshall Field's legal battle was unavailing, however, and, within days of Icahn securing the loan commitment from Banque Commerciale Privée, Marshall Field entered into a merger with Battis, Inc., the British retailer. Battis made a tender offer for all outstanding shares at $30. Icahn's average cost per share was about $17. The aggregate cost of all shares purchased by the Icahn Group was nearly $70 million, and Icahn had still not been tapped out. The bank loan of $20 million had never been taken down. With over $100 million of buying power now at his disposal, Icahn was a more fearsome predator than he had been before. The business establishment took note. One close associate of Icahn recalled that Lawrence Tisch, chairman of Lowe's and now of CBS Inc., said to him, "Tell Carl to cut this out. It's not good for the Jews." For Icahn, the deal had many satisfactions, and one was the settling of an old score. Back in 1978, when Icahn was just an arbitrager, betting from the sidelines, Marshall Field had made such a successful anti-takeover maneuver that Carter Hawley Hale dropped its hostile bid for the retailer, causing the price of Marshall Field stock to plummet. Icahn had lost $100,000 in one day. As much of a triumph as the Marshall Field raid was for Icahn, it soured him once and for all on having anything but passive limited partners. Before, he had formed limited partnerships of investors, college friends, his uncle, Schnall, his landlord at 42 Broadway, real estate magnate Zev Wolfson. Some entered these partnerships for as little as $50,000, and Icahn charged a management fee of 20%. The partners had no say in the decisions Icahn made. But in Marshall Field, for the Phi Rst time, he had formed a group with individuals who were more than passive. A Netherlands Antilles corporation called Pickera Valley, controlled by Alexander Gorin, Philip Sassauer and Lawrence Schneider, the same trio who had bought Flagstaff from Nelson Peltz in the late 70s. They had introduced Icahn to Steiner, shortly before this raid. When it was over, Icahn decided that in the future he would always insist upon having complete control and would never accept a partner who would not cede it to him. Neither Sassauer, Gorin nor Schneider has invested with him again. Steiner, however, became Icahn's most constant and largest investor. He says he has no problem with Icahn's autonomy. In this type of business, you can't be in a position where you have to get approval, Steiner declared. There has to be a captain. Carl is the captain. The key to these operations is being in control. After Marshall Field, the tempo of Icahn's raids quickened. Marshall Field had given him not only Professor ITS of about $17.60 million but a great boost in conference idents. He moved from Anchor Hawking to American Can to Owens, Illinois in rapid FIRE succession, bought out by each company at a premium over market within a week or two after his stock purchases. By the fall of 1982, Icahn had begun his battle with Dan River, a protracted, acrimonious Phi GHT, during which townspeople of Danville, Virginia, who had never owned stock in the company rose up to repel him, buying stock with money saved for vacations and retirement funds. The struggle finale ended in 1983 when management escaped Icahn by taking the company private in a leverage buyout. Icahn's Professor IT was $8.50 million. In the summer of 1983, Icahn pocketed a quick $19 million, his largest Professor IT to that date, when he sold his Gulf Plus Western stock at the market price to an institutional buyer, in a sale arranged through Gulf Plus Western's investment banking firm, Kidder, Peabody. To reap this Professor IT, he had invested more than $35.50 million, more than twice his commitment to the largest investment he had hitherto made, $14.30 million in Dan River. In June 1984, Icahn confounded many Icahn watchers by doing what he had insisted, in the Marshall Field depositions and the Dan River litigation, he had wanted to do all along. He acquired his target. He could have sold his stock in a railcar leasing company, ACF, to the company in a management-led buyout and made a handsome Professor IT, but chose to top the bid and take the company, for $410 million. National Westminster Bank USA, which had extended a $20 million loan commitment to an Icahn raid in late 1981, now was the lead bank in loans that totaled $225 million. The rest of the purchase price came from the sale of a major division of ACF just before the acquisition, in what was a highly unusual maneuver, and the post-acquisition sale of another division. Was the greenmail game dead? Had Icahn decided that no amount of fast-earned dollars was worth being called a racketeer? Was the scourge of corporate America going respectable? What now seems clear is that Icahn had decided it was time to move to the next plateau. He had been saying for a couple of years that what he really wanted to do was gain control of these companies and sell off some pieces. He no doubt meant this. In a stock market where companies were as undervalued as many were in the early 80s, it was feasible, if one chose the right companies, to gain control, sell off parts in order to pay for the cost of the acquisition, and be left with the best part of the company almost for free. Over the long term, it would be far more Professor I-table than grabbing a quick greenmail. It would also be less aggravation. Icahn had accumulated a fortune of over $100 million. Even with his rare hunger for dollars, he could now afford to be a little more choosy. Greenmail had become the bête noire of corporate America. From now on, taking greenmail openly was going to mean incessant suits from enraged shareholders and incessant beatings in the press. Moreover, Congress was up in arms about greenmail, and it seemed as though legislators might figure out a way to outlaw it. In March 1984, Icahn had testified before a congressional subcommittee and had said, somewhat surprisingly, that he agreed that they should end buybacks. But if they were going to end buybacks, he had argued, they should also make illegal all the defensive maneuvers open to managements. Do not let them print up stock. Do not let them issue themselves golden parachutes. Do not let them sell the crown jewels. Whether or not Congress outlawed greenmail was almost not the point. The point was, once an activity was so popularized that it was front-page news, what was Carl Icahn doing in it? He had made his fortune by entering a relatively undeveloped field, taking it farther than anyone else, and then, when it got too crowded and visible, moving a small step forward, in a natural progression. He had FIRST gone into puts and calls. As that became more popular, he had mixed it with classic arbitrage. When options exploded, he had gone into risk arbitrage. Then he had decided to better control the arbitrage, by becoming the principal himself. Now it was time to become, at least often enough to give him the credibility he would need to continue his progression, the acquirer. And this, interestingly enough, was when Leon Black came to call to offer Icahn a Drexel war chest. For in the summer of '84, at a go-by seminar, Black, Fred Joseph and others had been discussing their need to find those players whom no one else could or would finance, who therefore would be desperate enough to pay the price, in interest rates to the junk bond investors, and fees and equity stakes to Drexel, of Drexel's dollars. Icahn was one obvious candidate. While David K., head of Drexel's FL Edgeling M&A Group, objected to their representing the notorious green mailer, that objection was overruled. Icahn was, after all, a singularly able green mailer. He had amassed over $100 million in about 5 years, and his annualized return for that period was over 80%. It would hardly be like Drexel to place a higher value on respectability than on performance. Moreover, Icahn fit nicely into a plan that Black, then head of Drexel's LBO Group, was advancing, to get cash into players' hands by refinancing LBOs they had already done, replacing bank debt with junk bonds, and adding in a surplus for a war chest. How much surplus was right would vary in each case, depending upon the appetite of the player. For example, Drexel did a refinancing for William Farley, a small-time Chicago entrepreneur, who had acquired a company which he renamed Farley Metals. Drexel raised $80 million for the refinancing and $60 million for a war chest. About 1 year later, in the spring of 1985, Farley put that war chest, and more, to use when he made a $1 billion acquisition of Northwest Industries. Icahn's appetite dwarfed Farley's, but he was far less compliant. Farley gave Drexel 5% of equity in Farley Metals and accepted a Drexel-designated director, Leon Black, on the board. Icahn refused to give any equity, and he took no Drexel-designated director. In late 1984, Drexel raised $225 million for the refinancing of ACF, and the bulk of the remainder, roughly $155 million, went into a war chest. According to Black, however, Milken would have raised another $200 minus $300 million for Icon had he been willing to give up equity. Said Icon, "I don't like giving up equity. I've learned over the years, a dollar bill is a better partner than a partner." When Icon found his next target, in any event, he was not hampered by a lack of cash. Drexel was there, ready and willing to back him, in his $8.10 billion tender offer for Phillips Petroleum. In late December 1984, just weeks after the ACF junk bonds were sold, T. Boone Pickens, the most sanctimonious of the raiders, who had vowed often that he would never accept greenmail, was greenmailed out of his Phillips stock. Drexel had backed two hostile bids, both unconsummated, Pickens' Mesa Petroleum bid for Gulf Oil, and Saul Steinberg's Reliance bid for Walt Disney. It was eager now for one of its players to pick up the Phillips ball that Pickens had dropped. Phillips had announced a recapitalization plan in which all shareholders could participate, except that Pickens got cash in exchange for his stock while the rest of the shareholders were offered a package of cash and securities. The buzz on the street was that the Phillips recapitalization plan was much too low, and that the situation was therefore ripe for another bidder. We decided that since a lot of our clients, Ivan Boesky, Irwin Jacobs, Carl Icahn, were rumored to be holding big positions in Phillips stock, we should try to interest someone in doing the transaction, Drexel investment banker John Sort recalled. But it had to be someone not wanting greenmail. We'd now used the high-yield weapon twice, in Gulf and then in Disney, where Steinberg took greenmail. And we decided we shouldn't be using this weapon for greenmail. Too much criticism. Drexel tried to interest companies they thought might be bona fide acquirers of Phillips. Pennzoil, which had recently lost Getty Oil to Texaco, was one. David Kay thought Pennzoil was a natural, said Sort, but I'm not sure they ever returned his phone call. David Kay and others in M&A did lots of cold calls. In the end, the only interest that Drexel was able to stir was Icon's. Flush with his ACF war chest, Icahn had begun buying Phillips stock in late December, 2 days after the company's announcement of its recapitalization plan and its buyout of Pickens. In February 1985 he decided to wage a proxy fight GHT to defeat Phillips' recapitalization plan, which was to be voted on at an annual shareholders meeting on February 22. He hired another Wall Street firm, Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette, Inc., for the proxy solicitation. The open question was whether Icahn would accompany his proxy fight GHT with a tender offer. In the past he had preferred to combine the two, because used in concert they put far more pressure on the target. But a tender for Phillips would be exponentially greater than any that he, or, for that matter, Drexel, had done before. The junk bond financed hostile takeover was so nascent that there was no blueprint. In Mesa's run at Gulf, before there was any public announcement of an offer, Milken and his troops had obtained commitments for about $2.20 billion from their network of bond buyers. Drexel had circulated not the commitment letters that later became boilerplate, but thick securities purchase agreements, which were haggled over endlessly by Drexel and the prospective purchasers' lawyers. Those who were thus solicited became insiders and were prohibited from either trading in Gulf stock or divulging the information. But word did leak out, or some of those solicited bought stock, and the stock price traded up so rapidly that the deal became too expensive for Pickens to make the tender offer. Instead, Drexel had negotiated a $300 million private placement for Mesa with Penn Central, controlled by Carl Lindner, and Pickens had used that to make a far smaller offer, which ultimately sent Gulf into the arms of a white knight, Standard Oil of California. Now it was clear that, with Phillips, Drexel could not attempt to obtain oral commitments before an announcement and take the risk of a run-up in stock price. Icahn came up with an alternative: to borrow methodology from the establishment. When major corporations launched their hostile takeovers, they did so on the basis of commitment letters for the financing from commercial banks. Drexel, Icahn suggested, should act like those banks and give him a commitment letter. Swart and Black thought that Icahn's demand was outrageous. Drexel, they argued, was acting merely as agent for the lenders to Icahn, and if it gave him a commitment letter, the amount would be charged against the firm's capital. In 2 years, however, this strange notion would be known as bridge financing, and would be the rage on Wall Street. Investment banks would commit their own capital to a deal, in a bridge, between the time of the offer and the time it actually had to be funded. By funding time, the investment bank would have placed much if not all of the debt with bond buyers. Trying to respond to Icahn's demand for a letter of commitment, Black finally ventured, "Why don't we say we're highly conference ident, that we can raise it? It's really different. It hasn't been done before." Carl looked at me, Black recalled. He turned to his lawyer and said, "What do you think?" His lawyer said, "Leon's full of shit. It's not legally binding, what good is it?" Sometime in the early hours of the morning the meeting broke up, with Icahn saying he was no longer interested in doing the tender offer. But the next morning he called Black and said, "You know that highly conference ident letter you were talking about? That was the beginning of Drexel's famed, highly conference ident. The pronouncement that would seem, for a time, almost talismanic in its power." One after another, multi-billion-dollar tender offers were launched on the power of those 2 words, uttered by Drexel. It became an article of faith for Milken that once he had said he was highly conference ident, that he could raise a given amount of financing for a bid, he would never renege or cut back on the terms, because then, of course, the words would be just words. It took some time before Black and his colleagues recognized fully the magic of the highly conference ident letter. In Phillips, they charged Icahn $1 million for it. By the time they launched the Mesa Unocal raid for Pickens, 2 months later, they were charging $3.50 million for it, although they changed the words to firmly believe, because highly conference ident had become too charged a phrase in Congress. Icahn's bid for Phillips was the FI-RST tender offer ever launched without its financing in place, and the FI-RST in which no banks were to participate. Icahn was proposing that he acquire Phillips in an $8.10 billion deal that was part cash and part securities. The cash portion, which Drexel had said it was highly conference ident it could raise, was $4.05 billion. And this $4 billion was to be raised from an amalgam of senior notes, senior subordinated notes, and preferred stock, all placed with Milken's army of buyers. Thus, Phillips was to be, essentially, a hostile leveraged buyout. Icahn would pay the debt with Phillips' own cash FLAO. Icahn formed a dummy partnership, for which Milken would sell junk bonds, ultimately secured by the assets of Phillips. If the transaction went through, Icahn would pay down his mountain of debt, $11 billion, set atop an equity sliver of $800 million, by selling off some assets and utilizing the company's cash FLAO. Unlike the friendly leveraged buyouts that Black had structured, in which commercial banks, typically, were the lenders for the senior level of debt and Drexel placed the subordinated debt, with Phillips even the senior level was to be lent by Milken's network. For some time, Milken had been asking his fellows, "Why do we need the commercial banks?" With Phillips, Drexel announced to the world that they did not. The world, however, was disbelieving. Phillips and its advisors charged in the ensuing litigation that Milken's highly conference ident assertion was nothing but sleight of hand. The company ran full-page newspaper ads demanding, "Is Icahn for real?" Icahn, meanwhile, had been holding Drexel back from the next step, which was obtaining written commitments from the bond buyers. It was going to cost him, which is why he had been postponing it, but after the taunting ads he gave Drexel the go-ahead. He would have to pay a commitment fee to the subscribers of 0.3%, or $37,500 for each $10 million pledged. In the abortive Mesa Gulf deal, those who had committed orally to buy the bonds received nothing for their trouble, while Mesa walked away with a net gain of $214 million after taxes. Milken had realized then that his customers would have to be paid to play in the future. If Drexel raised these commitments and the deal did not go through, Icahn would have to pay Drexel 1/8% of all the commitments obtained. Drexel had fought hard with Icahn to be paid 1% of the commitments raised, as they had been in Disney. But Disney, Icahn had argued, was a $700 million deal, and this was $4 billion. Instead, he got the 1/8% in return for agreeing to pay Drexel 20% of his Professor ITS if he sold his stock. This Professor IT sharing would become boilerplate in future Drexel-backed raids. With all these hefty surcharges, therefore, Icahn did not want to raise the entire $4 billion, and with the vote on management's recapitalization plan just a week away, it was unlikely, anyhow, that Milken could raise the $4 billion in time. According to Black, Milken was pressing Icahn to let him raise $2 billion, but Icahn drew the line at $1.50 billion. In 48 hours, it was done. Sort commented, "Lots of the buyers now were the same ones that we'd lined up 1 year before in Mesa Gulf, when they obtained $2.20 billion in oral commitments. And we kept a lot of our powder dry. For example, we didn't put in the S&Ls, even though we had lots of them. We realized that if we started having lots of S&Ls in hostile deals, we would jeopardize their ability to be in any, because of the growing concern in Congress about junk bonds and thrifts investments in them. And a lot of our big buyers weren't there. Executive Life wasn't there. Columbia S&L wasn't there. Carl Lindner wasn't there. We wanted people to think we were not stretched. Some of the faithful, of course, were there. Meshulam Riklis, Shenley Industries, came in for $25 million. Nelson Peltz, Triangle Industries, $20 million. David Solomon, Solomon Asset Management, $50 million. And Steve Wynn, Golden Nugget, $40 million. The biggest pieces were taken by the Beltzbergs, Charles Knapp and Atlantic Capital. The Beltzbergs, through 3 of the entities they controlled, First City Properties, First City Financial and Far West Financial Services, weighed in for $287.50 million. Knapp, through Trafalgar Holdings, signed up for $100 million. Since Milken had not raised that mythical $1 billion for Trafalgar, it seems highly unlikely that Knapp had $100 million to contribute to anything at this point. More likely, this was a way for his air fund to earn a commitment fee of $375,000. 2 months later, Knapp would commit $15 million to the Peltz and May Triangle National Can deal, and then back out. And, finally, Atlantic Capital, which appeared on the list submitted to the SEC under a disguised name, Worldwide Trading Services, came in for $100 million, taking $50 million in preferred stock, which was the biggest chunk of preferred by far. It seems unlikely that Icahn intended to take the company. One of his advisors recalled the night when Icahn was told that the proxy solicitation was going well and that he might well win the company. His attitude was, "Holy shit. And we sat him down and started to tell him about an oil company. You know, holes in the ground that are called wells. Carl is a very smart man, but he didn't know a helluva lot about the oil business. In the end, Icahn won his proxy contest. Phillips had instituted a poison pill, the defense mechanism created by takeover lawyer Martin Lipton, which is triggered by a would-be acquirers buying a certain percentage of the target's stock and gives shareholders such extravagant rights that the company is rendered far less desirable. Designed to protect the company from being taken over by Icahn or any other bidder, so the recapitalization plan would seem to have been the shareholders' most attractive option. But in a dramatic display of new shareholder activism, shareholders voted down the recap plan. Then the company sweetened the plan, and Icahn decided to sell his stock and move on. He had invested about $175 million in Phillips stock, mainly with his war chest money from Drexel's refinancing of ACF. And now his trading professor ITS on the 10-week deal were $52.50 million, more than twice what he had ever made in a deal before. Icahn did not retreat from the Phi Eldav battle without a long night of haggling, however. He had declared publicly that he would not take greenmail. But expenses were something else. Phillips was prepared to pay him $25 million. Icahn insisted that his expenses were $27 million. One advisor in this deal insisted that even the $25 million was a Professor IT making, not break-even, deal for Icahn. Hours went by. The other side did not budge. In the end he gave in because the Phillips people dug in their heels, said Anthony James, of Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette. The Phillips board had authorized a maximum of $25 million, and they weren't going to meet again. So it was take it or leave it. That's the only way to deal with Carl. You have to cut off your avenues of retreat. Otherwise, he'll just keep nibbling away at you. Carl will fight GHT endlessly for the last million, the last $500,000. He will fight GHT for the last penny. While Icahn prides himself, as he so often says, on being a man of my word, James, who has also been opposite Icahn in deals, counters that Icahn is a man of his word, in a sense. With Carl, the deal's never over till it's over, till you have negotiated every possible last detail. We have corporate clients who, once you've agreed with them on the major piece of a deal, will bend over backwards to be fair, to drive the other 10 unnegotiated pieces together so that the deal happens. Carl would take every one of those 10 things and use them to negotiate every last advantage. Icahn, said James, is different from most people who care about how they appear, and therefore feel certain restrictions on their conduct. Carl is not impeded that way. He is guided only by what is in his economic interest, and so he's been a lot more successful than most. Phillips was Drexel's gala coming out, the $1.50 billion bash that proclaimed to corporate America and its investment bankers that Drexel had come of age. For Icahn, the fated raider, who heretofore had made his idiosyncratic ascent in measured, self-propelled steps, it was a giant, almost magical, step up. After Phillips, however, Icahn went his own way. Unlike Peltz, who, once Milken had enthroned him at national can, made no meaningful move in the M&A world that was not orchestrated by his benefactor, Icahn continued to do what he had always done: choose his targets with Kingsley, move against them on his own. But by mid-1985 Drexel had become so ubiquitous in the M&A world that wherever Icahn turned, Drexel showed up, too. Sometimes Icahn and Drexel, although independent, seemed to complement each other. For example, in April 1985, Icahn, who had accumulated a 10% position in Uniroyal, threatened a takeover. The company's management then took it private in a leveraged buyout, financed by Drexel. And Peltz, with Milken's help, would later acquire the core chemical business of Uniroyal. But in TWA, Icahn and Drexel found themselves at odds. TWA was a Drexel client, albeit a far more prosaic and less important one than Icahn. Drexel had raised $100 million in financing for the airline in 1984. When TWA executives learned in mid-April that Icahn was accumulating the company's stock, therefore, the first thing they did was seek Drexel's protection, exhorting Fred Joseph to persuade Icahn to retreat. It was in fact Drexel's policy, known as the Joseph Doctrine, never to assist an aggressor client in depredations against another client, but to go to the defense of the victim. The necessity for that policy is self-evident, according to Leon Black. Drexel's client list is a roster of raiders. How could any corporate client open up to us if they thought we would help one of our clients take them over? Another Drexel executive added that the policy was sometimes phrased more bluntly to prospective clients. Pay us, become our clients, and we'll protect you. Adding to the TWA executives' indignation was the fact that their chief financial officer, Robert Picer, had made a presentation on the airline at the Predators Ball 2 weeks earlier. After Picer's talk, Icahn had introduced himself and engaged him in conversation for about 15 minutes. They were casual questions, kind of bantering, but Carl's got a way of asking probing casual questions, Picer recalled. And afterwards, a number of people who had been standing around, listening to us, came up to warn me that he was really interested in the cash flow of the company. Now Picer and others at TWA felt badly used, as though they had been offered on a menu to Drexel's partygoers. I really tried to dissuade Carl, said Joseph. I told him that we couldn't support him. Most important, though, I said I didn't think it was a good business for him. Joseph raised a number of disadvantages. It's capital intensive. It's in the midst of deregulation, so it's a free-for-all, but still regulated enough that you can't do lots of things. There's a history of adversarial labor relations. It's dependent on a volatile commodity, jet fuel. Pricing is a complicated chess game, so if somebody else in the industry makes a mistake, you can get hurt. I kept going through this litany, Joseph said, and Carl kept saying, "Stop, stop, I'm going to throw up, stop." Moreover, from a political standpoint, Joseph thought Icahn's timing could not have been worse. I told him I'd just been down in Washington, getting screamed at by Senator Thomas F. Eagleton. Joseph had recently testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Securities headed by Senator Alphonse D'Amato. The raids on Phillips Petroleum, FIRST by T. Boone Pickens and then by Icahn, and Unocal, by Pickens, had created a backlash, and a lot of anti-takeover legislation was being introduced. A raid which might result in the dismemberment of an airline as symbolic as TWA would add fury to the storm. Icahn was aware of the trouble in Washington. Just 2 months earlier, in the midst of his Drexel-backed raid on Phillips Petroleum, he had testified before a House subcommittee. He had lectured the congressman on the ineptitude of American corporate management, regaling them with a couple of his usual routines, slightly tempered for this crowd, on his misadventures in a corporate world where, to hear him tell it, he alone had the gumption to declare that the emperor wore no clothes. Leon Black thought Drexel's warnings just whetted Icahn's appetite. And Drexel was caught in the middle. They had sworn they would not represent the aggressor but were rejected by the victim because they were so close to the aggressor. At the start, the firm acted as intermediary, hosting several meetings between Icahn's and TWA's representatives. Meanwhile, Icahn continued to buy stock. On April 29 he crossed the 5% threshold, and when he led his FIRST 13D with the Securities and Exchange Commission, 10 days later, He owned not 8 or 9% of TWA's stock, as its management had feared, but 20%. In the beginning, the directors, managers and rank-and-file employees of TWA viewed Icahn much as his other targets had, as a pariah. TWA led the usual battery of lawsuits, seeking an injunction against Icahn's buying any more TWA stock or commencing a tender offer or a proxy GHT. The airline petitioned the U.S. Department of Transportation to investigate whether Icahn was FI-T to run an air carrier. It encouraged the unions to mobilize against Icahn. Employees lobbied legislators and wore "Stop Carl Icahn" buttons. TWA solicited help from Congress. And in a congressional hearing in early June, 1 month after Icahn had surfaced with 20% of the company, the president of TWA, C.E. Meyer, Jr., called him one of the greediest men on earth. Icahn also testified at that hearing, and he revealed a fine appreciation of his own abilities, a conference idents perhaps born of the fact that to this time he had suffered no major loss. Asked by one member of the congressional panel why he had chosen TWA as a target, Icahn responded, "Do you ask Willie Mays why he jumped a certain way for a ball? Or do you ask McEnroe why he holds the racket a certain way?" In fact, Icahn and Kingsley had been lured to the airline in large measure by what they read as its ample cash flow, the Raiders' lodestone. TWA was basically breaking even, but it had, according to Icahn's calculations, about $200 million in depreciation. In the Drexel-hosted meetings with Meyer, CFO Robert Peiser and other TWA executives, Icahn had talked a great deal about the airline's cash flow. Meyer had argued that it was unpredictable, because in the crisis-ridden airline business, vulnerable to strikes and to terrorist attacks which halted tourism, it could disappear overnight. Icahn was unimpressed. But on another point he was persuaded. He had had a tentative plan to partially liquidate the airline, discontinuing domestic routes and selling planes. But in the course of these meetings the TWA officials convinced him that that liquidation plan was not viable. In an evidentiary hearing before U.S. District Judge John Cannella, Icahn testified to having been so persuaded. "I go by instinct," he said, explaining this sudden sea change in the middle of a deal in which he had reportedly already invested over $100 million. He emphasized that, in fact, he preferred a course that did not require selling off major assets. "I was never in love with liquidating a lot of planes," he testified. "I don't want to get the image of a liquidator." So the plan changed, but the newly image-conscious Icahn was seemingly undeterred. Judge Cannella found him credible and denied TWA's request for a temporary restraining order against Icahn, which would have stymied him. He continued to accumulate stock. After Cannella's decision, the directors of TWA decided that the company had to be put up for sale. Though Resorts International showed some interest, in the end the only clearly committed white knight was Frank Lorenzo of Texas Air. Frank Lorenzo, who had started his career as a financial analyst at TWA, had bootstrapped himself into the aviation business by taking over the ailing Texas International Airlines in 1972. He had long harbored an ambition to own TWA. If he added TWA to Continental and New York Air, both owned by Texas Air, the market share of those three carriers would be second only to United Airlines. Lorenzo was represented by Drexel. TWA had hired Salomon Brothers, not Drexel, because the TWA directors did not trust Drexel. And while Kidder, Peabody had been Texas Air's traditional investment banker in this transaction, which would be essentially a leveraged buyout, with the financing of about $750 million raised largely from the sale of junk bonds, only Drexel could place the debt. The Drexel investment banker working for Lorenzo was Leon Black. Black and Icahn had become such good friends during the course of their ACF-REF financing negotiations and then the Phillips campaign that, from the start of this transaction, Lorenzo and some TWA advisors were uneasy about the relationship. One night in mid-June, Icahn, Black and other Lorenzo advisors, and a host of lawyers and investment bankers for TWA held an all-night meeting to structure a three-way peace. Icahn would sell his stock into the Texas Air Trois merger, making a Professor IT of roughly $79 million, and would also receive an additional package of about $16 million. This was not to be greenmail. Icahn did not want greenmail anymore, but he did want money, so this was a package of expenses and other benefits. Had Lorenzo paid Icahn his price, TWA would have gone down in the annals of corporate raids as a vintage Icahn deal, in which he was a buyer at one price but a seller at another, and his advances forced the company to sell to a third bidder. All that would have differentiated this deal from its predecessors would be his Professor IT, at $95 million, his biggest yet. But because Lorenzo was unwilling to pay Icahn his $16 million greenmail alternative, what should have been the close of the deal became its opening curtain. Lorenzo was not present at that night-long session, and when Black, who had been negotiating with what he and everyone else in that conference room believed was authority from Lorenzo, called him at dawn to say that the deal had been struck, Lorenzo rejected it. Instead of the $16 million, he made a counteroffer to Icahn of $8 minus $9 million, which Icahn refused. According to former employees of Lorenzo, this is his modus operandi, always to be absent from the negotiating session, so that he is free to say the negotiator had no authority, and then to scrap the deal. For Lorenzo, these former employees say, the moment he sees that a deal in which he is the buyer can be struck at X, that says to him that it could have been done at X-3 or X-2. I argued with Lorenzo. I lost, said Black. And then he lost. Icahn kept his 35% of TWA as the company, and Lorenzo proceeded with the deal to have Lorenzo buy the airline, or so they all thought. In a vacuum, Lorenzo was right, Black said. Once he had a merger agreement with TWA, he felt, why should he buy out Carl? Carl didn't know the airline industry. You had to conceive of Carl galvanizing the unions and taking it away. And at that moment no one could have. On the other hand, my feeling was that we weren't talking about a lot of money, the $16 million package. When you have a 35% holder who has proven in the past to be a dangerous adversary, why not take out an insurance policy? Of Lorenzo's actions in this deal, Black declared, if ever defeat was snatched out of the jaws of victory, this was it. What unfolded over the course of the next 2.5 months, at the end of which TWA's board finale voted to accept Icahn's bid and reject Lorenzo's slightly higher one, was a humiliation for Lorenzo and a triumph for Icahn. Lorenzo's poor business judgment was there for all the world to see as he continued to offer higher and higher, though never quite high enough, amounts to buy Icahn out, and as Icahn maneuvered himself into ever more favorable positions. Having refused to spend an extra $16 million to secure the airline, Lorenzo ultimately offered $100 million, to no avail. And while Lorenzo reneged on a handshake deal and breached an unwritten agreement, Icahn conducted himself so that he was able to proclaim later that he had been a man of my word, and everyone in this particular deal, at least, concurred. Icahn's transformation from hated pariah to a kind of secondary white knight, offering the unions an escape from Lorenzo, after Lorenzo had given TWA an escape from him, was made possible by virtue of one fact. To the unions, Lorenzo was evil incarnate. In 1983 he had sought protection under Chapter 11 for Continental Airlines, abrogated its union contracts and cut wages in half. Then he had proceeded to turn the airline into a moneymaker. Next to Frank Lorenzo, Carl Icahn suddenly looked good. After TWA struck its deal with Lorenzo, and Lorenzo left Icahn free with his 35% holding, the unions approached Icahn. TWA's labor costs were dramatically higher than competing airlines, and the TWA management had been readying itself for a strike as its labor contracts came due for negotiation. Now, as they were about to fall into the clutches of Lorenzo, the union signaled that they would be less intransigent than TWA had feared. Labor negotiators are known for their stamina in the typically marathon sessions that sometimes seem to exhaust their management adversaries. But, for Icahn, a veteran of hundreds of night-long negotiations who, some have suspected, deliberately prolongs these sessions because he is having such a good time, this situation with the unions was tailor-made. Unlike most managements, which use labor experts to deal with the unions, Icahn dealt with them directly. Negotiating is probably the thing Icahn does best in life. He brings to it his considerable talents as a poker player, bluffing masterfully, so his opponents never know whether he is going to play or fold. He sketches so many options, and so many variations, or hedgings, on those options, that his adversaries often feel they are lost in a maze. The positions he takes are in such flux that for his adversary to try to challenge or attack them is, as one recalls, like wrestling with a ghost. And he keeps constant vigil over his own vulnerability. As one individual who has dealt with Icahn says, he is so paranoid, always looking over his shoulder and behind every door, constantly thinking everyone is screwing him. As a result, Carl gets few surprises. By early August, Icahn had exploited his talents as a negotiator and the union's distrust of Lorenzo to reach an agreement with not only the pilots' union but also the union representing the machinists, a tough, headstrong and volatile group, who were lower paid than the pilots and thus had less to give away. It amazed TWA management and their advisors that Icahn had been able to extract his desired concessions out of the machinists. But there it was. In return for Professor IT sharing in stock ownership, Icahn had wrung concessions from the two unions, though not from the FLIT attendants, concessions that would eventually turn the airline from breaking even to $300 million in Professor IT's. Having made his deal with the unions, Icahn could now top Lorenzo's bid. Lorenzo, aware that the airline was slipping from his grasp, raised his bid, and also brought in Martin Siegel of Kidder, Peabody to advise him. Kidder had been his traditional investment banking firm, and he had worked with Siegel before. In the last 5 years, moreover, the bright, flashy good-looking Siegel had become one of the stars of the takeover Eld. According to two Lorenzo advisors, Lorenzo turned to Siegel as his distrust of Drexel, particularly of Black, became overwhelming. He would keep Drexel in the picture as his money raiser, he had no choice, but in the 9th inning he was desperate for Drexel-free advice. By this time, in the late summer of 1985, it was not easy to escape the Drexel presence. Unbeknownst to Lorenzo, Siegel had, since June, been deep in discussions with Fred Joseph about moving to Drexel. Siegel, of course, was the recruitment assignment Joseph had taken after the Cavas go-by session 3 years earlier. It was only in the last 6 months, since Drexel entered and transformed the M&A world, that long-ago goal had become something more than a pipe dream. Siegel had been in another deal with Drexel recently. In the Storer Communications buyout, he had represented Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, the premier LBO firm. And now he was in TWA. As Siegel said later, he had watched as his peers at Drexel made 5 times what he was making in these deals, and he was not used to being the margarine spread. Moreover, in Storer, KKR had beaten out a rival bidder because Milken could raise $1.466 billion in 2 days. Black was the Drexel investment banker on that deal, and he had courted Siegel assiduously. It made Siegel think more seriously about what it would mean to work for a firm with that kind of muscle. He was tempted. He knew he could multiply his income if he went to Drexel. His father had gone bankrupt at 45, and Siegel believed that this had planted in him a powerful longing for utter financial independence, what he thought of as, "fuck you, money." But he was still not sure that the Drexel lucre was worth the taint. Henry Kravis, of Kohlberg Kravis, one of his best friends, had advised him against doing it, for that reason. But he was thinking about it. In TWA, Siegel was able to do no better for Lorenzo than Black had done. Even though Lorenzo had made a bid higher than Icon's, once Icon reached his agreements with the unions, he held all the tickets. With those agreements in hand, Icon could offer TWA labor peace and a financially viable airline. Had the board sided with Lorenzo, on the other hand, they would have had to utilize an anti-takeover maneuver to block Icon, which he would certainly have challenged in court. And if the deal with Lorenzo did survive court challenge, it guaranteed labor havoc. The pilots were promising wildcat strikes, and the machinists let it be known that they might vent their frustration by destroying planes.